Let's get started with this list and my incredibly subjective ranking that you will almost certainly not agree with. And if you do see a story on this list where you don't agree with my ranking, then feel free to just leave your own list down below. And with that said, let us beware of spoilers for the show throughout this video while discussing the 12 modern era Doctor Who series openers. Though I do like every story on this list, New Earth is the closest to being a bad episode. And as said, I actually enjoy it. I think it's decent, it's got some fun elements in it, it is a little bit lighthearted in places, but sometimes the blend of all of these different elements with these really quite unsettling makeup effects do make for a bit of an odd mix in this story, and it is absolutely fine to have elements that are at odds with one another, but in this case, they don't feel particularly cohesive. These really dark elements combined with these really lighthearted elements, it just doesn't totally work for me. And also sometimes the body swapping stuff isn't that entertaining. Sometimes they have fun with it, and other times it's just, yeah, it's okay. On the whole, I do enjoy this story, but it is definitely the weakest one on this list, and isn't great. I find Smith & Jones to be a really good introduction to Martha's character. I like the setting of the hospital on the moon, it's particularly unique, and you've got such a weird thing going on here with the Judoon not actually invading and thus taking the hospital and putting it on the moon where they are able to look for the person who they are trying to find, and it's just kind of a really weird situation, and it makes for a particularly entertaining episode, which I have a lot of fun with. Tennant is really good in this story, and I think he gets better in his second season, and him and Martha have good chemistry. And the Judoon are kind of a unique presence in this story, which just make it a little bit of fun. And yeah, I think this is a really solid one and a good introduction to this season. I'm expecting there are some people who will not be happy with Partners in Crime being this low on the list, but do know that I do enjoy this story. I think it is solid. It's a lot of fun. I love seeing the build-up as we see the Doctor and Donna just not quite meeting up, and I think there's genuinely a lot of fun to be had in this one with them going on this adventure and having just this incredible chemistry where it works even better than it did in their previous adventure, The Runaway Bride. And I think this one just has so much going for it and sets up what is one of my favorite series of the show in a really fun, lighthearted, and entertaining way. It does so much right and does very little wrong. I do feel that the 10th Doctor does get better with every subsequent series, and I think that he is excellent in this one, and his chemistry with Donna is absolutely brilliant, and they have such a great dynamic as friends, which is so much fun to watch in this story. And while the rest of the story is pretty average, I think these two characters together and the tone that this story is going for just make it a pretty memorable and entertaining one. As you can tell, the Russell T Davies openers are a little bit lower on my list, and that's a shame, but do know that I legitimately enjoy all of them, this one the most of the four. Now, there are some elements in this that I can point to and say that doesn't really work, but there's so much in this one that is absolutely brilliant. I think introducing the show in its revival through the lens of this companion and how she learns about this character, it just does so much right for the show and allows you to get to know this character through the lens of this new character, and the way that is done throughout this story is just really good. And it does have some elements, even more so than the previous two stories, that I do look to and say, yeah, the garbage can burping, that doesn't totally work. The stuff with Auton Mickey I find to be a little bit silly, but the stuff that does work in this one, to me, works so well and works as such a great introduction to this Doctor and just a really enjoyable story. They absolutely knocked it out of the park in all of the ways that they really needed to by making this just a fantastic introduction to a fantastic Doctor with a great companion and a pretty solid use of the Autons as well. What I do appreciate about Deep Breath is that it manages to take its time in telling its story. I really do enjoy how we are introduced to this new Doctor through the character of Clara. It is in that way quite similar to the episode The Christmas Invasion, where we are also introduced to a new Doctor with a companion who was with the previous Doctor and just saw him change his face. And as a story, there's a lot of different elements in which come together to make, I think, quite a solid one. I really enjoy the villain of this piece and how the episode plays with something that you are not able to do, a natural human thing that you have to, but you cannot in the face of these villains. That's something Steve Moffat is very good at doing. And I really like the idea of the villain in this one, where it is replacing its parts so much that all of a sudden it really isn't what it was in the first place. And I just think that works really well, and we get some darker aspects to this Doctor that leads him to asking the question, am I a good man? It's just a good story, and I really enjoy what's done in this one. The Woman Who Fell to Earth is kind of an interesting one for me because there are certain aspects to this that just make it what it is, that just add to something that is greater than the sum of its parts. Because I really do enjoy this introduction of the Doctor and these characters and find this to be a good start to Chibnall's era of Doctor Who. I think Tim Shaw works well as a villain. I really enjoy the Doctor. I think the companions work pretty well, and we get good setup for who all these people are, while having a pretty entertaining story that feels particularly unique. There's no story really in the Chibnall era that I would say feels like The Woman Who Fell to Earth. To me, this one just has this specific flavor to it which is somewhat indescribable. And I look at this episode and I say, you know what, this is a good episode. But there's something to it that I always look back on fondly and go, yeah, I really like that one. It's really quite hard for me to describe, and if I was able to better, then I definitely would. But there's something about this one that elevates it from just a good episode to really quite a memorable one for me. Like The Woman Who Fell to Earth, this is another one that just has a little bit of magic to it. You look at this episode in its composite parts, and it's a good episode. I like what it's doing. I enjoy the introduction of this new companion and the Doctor and their dynamic with him being her professor and how she is brought into his class. I like all this stuff going on there. But again, this is a story where I find it difficult to explain exactly why this one is kind of special to me in the way that it is. This one and The Woman Who Fell to Earth are quite low on this list because there's just so many openers that I really enjoy, but both of them have this particularly unique style to them that the show never really entirely captures throughout the rest of their individual series. At least that's how I feel. And I just find this one to be such an entertaining introduction to this new companion, and I absolutely love the way it kind of reintroduces you to this Doctor. If you're looking at any Capaldi story and trying to figure out which series it belongs to, besides the obvious things like the length of his hair and the companion, one of the ways you can really tell what series he's from is the way that he's acting, because I do feel that he has some sort of a progression and arc throughout his era, and in this one is the start of him being sort of happy again. We've seen his heart absolutely broken throughout Series 9, and this one is kind of a new start for the show where he does get to be a little bit more happy, he does have a new and interesting thing going on, and it does very much feel like just such a fresh episode for the show. Asylum of the Daleks. I'm not going to talk too much about this one because I did discuss it quite recently, but I just thought there was a lot to enjoy in it. I think there's so much fun to be had in this one. I think it is a really good start to Series 7, which is a mixed series for me, and this is just a great reintroduction to these characters, and we get to see a little bit of a different thing going on here with the Doctor, Amy, and Rory. I think this one has a lot of great dialogue, is just an absolutely fun adventure, and has some really interesting stuff with the introduction of Oswin Osgood, which we see come together throughout the rest of the series. It is true that the Daleks aren't used to their full potential in this story, but I do like the glimpses of them that we get and the kind of unique things that we see happen with all these Daleks on the planet, and particularly discovering that Oswin Oswald herself was also a Dalek. I found that to be a great and surprising reveal that just really worked. The Magician's Apprentice and The Witch's Familiar. Again, I did talk about this one recently, so I won't spend too much time here, but this one does a lot of interesting stuff in terms of playing with what was done in Genesis of the Daleks and doing some similar things in a very different way. Plus, you have a lot of interesting stuff going on here with Missy and Clara, and I think they work really well together, and we do get some changes in terms of how Daleks work. Some new stuff is introduced here, which I personally found to be quite interesting. So the stuff that we see with those two characters and the Daleks works quite well, But the main stuff that really works for me is everything going on with Davros and the Doctor's dilemma of what to do. It is a similar thing to Genesis in ways and very different in others, and I think it is played with in a really interesting manner that I find incredibly entertaining. I really like this one. I think Davros is great. I think Missy is great. I think the Doctor is great. I think Clara is great. And this was just a really good introduction to this new series of the show, which I really enjoyed. I absolutely adore this story. There's something just quite special about this introduction to this new Doctor and to the companion of Amy, and this story manages to have so much fun throughout it and just moves at an absolutely excellent pace. For a lot of this one, the show is moving really fast. It does occasionally slow down to give you some really thoughtful scenes, which I think are quite interesting, but most of the story is working on setting up this new Doctor, and it's handled so well. I'm just amazed at how brilliantly this opener was pulled off for not just a series of the show, but for this new Doctor. And right in this first episode, Matt Smith is excellent, Karen Gillan is excellent, and it is pretty much a perfect jumping on point for new audiences, and makes for a truly memorable and delightful story that I just had a blast with. The weakest thing about this does have to be the villain in Prisoner Zero, and yeah, while that doesn't always work, I do think that there is some stuff that actually is handled well, even though the villain itself is a little bit simple, but that is fair enough as the episode does focus so much on introducing these new characters, and it does such a great job of that. The Impossible Astronaut and Day of the Moon. This is a two-parter I think does so much right. I think the Silents are just an excellent villain throughout this story and work really well. It's got a great resolution. There's a lot of really interesting stuff for this series that is set up in this one, and whatever you have to say about the way it's resolved, I know I have lots to say, this setup is really good, and I think it works brilliantly and does so much right in terms of hooking the viewer throughout that first episode as you lead into the second episode. Amy, Rory, Riversong, and the Doctor are all brilliant, and Mark Sheppard makes quite a welcome guest appearance as well, and I just think this story is quite creepy, quite interesting, does a lot of clever things that really works, and is to me one of the better two-parters in New Who. Spyfall. Yes, this is the newest one. It is only about 6 months old now, and I just think it is absolutely fantastic. This two-parter is brilliant. On first watch with Spyfall Part 1, I did really enjoy it, but every time I revisit it, I seem to love it even more. I love the style of it, I love the different things it's doing, I love the way that it sets up the second part, I love how much fun that you get to have throughout this story with these characters, while getting these kind of weird and interesting villains, and of course the twist at the end of Part 1 is absolutely fantastic, and I did not see it coming in any way, and they really did use that in the second part with the Master, who was just fantastic. I was by no means expecting to see the Master again this soon. I didn't necessarily think it was even a good idea, but I was 100% okay with it because he was so brilliant and worked so well. And I love seeing the Doctor really be pushed in this story in many ways, particularly towards the end of both the first and the second part, because towards the end of the first part, we see them really lose control. It's such a fantastic sequence, as throughout Series 11, yeah, they had some struggles along the way, but at the end of this first part of Series 12, they are really just thrown right into it. And not only does it feel like there are legitimate stakes, but in the second part of the story, we see that there really are, and we see the Doctor be tested quite a bit when she sees that her home planet is destroyed. I love what this story does. It does so much here that it's impossible for me to go over it all, but needless to say, this is a brilliant introduction to Series 12 and does a fantastic job of introducing you to everything that it needs to not just set up the series, but tell a great and thoroughly entertaining story, which I just could not have been more pleased by. Wow, this was a hard ranking to put together. I have got to be honest, while making this list, I switched back and forth a couple of times on placements of ones, and I think while I'm editing, they're going to switch a little bit too, because I thought about them a little bit more, and I'm like, no, actually, I love this one a little bit more than this one, but these are all good episodes, with New Earth being the one that is a little bit mixed. And if you would like to, then please leave your ranking of these premieres down below. I am very interested in hearing what you have to say about these stories, and with all that said, I do hope to see you around this upcoming Sunday. I will have a review out for the Mind Robber. And throughout the month, as I said, I'm going to have some more in-depth videos, particularly throughout the entire summer. We'll have a few of those. So I do hope to see you on Sunday, and if not, maybe later in the month or maybe later in the summer. But if not, that's totally cool, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and have a lovely week.